EVO. Welcome back to The Devil Within, starting a brand new series this week. Let me explain. So first, I need to give you all a brief history of an ancestor of mine, my maternal grandfather, Richard Ross. Grandpa Ross was born in the early 1920s, was a standout engineering and mathematics student in high school and in college. After Pearl Harbor, he joined the Navy and served his country during World War II. But after a few years in the Navy, the government called him away for a different type of service for the war effort, where he joined a growing number, in the thousands actually, of nuclear physicists and theoretical physicists and mathematicians and craftsmen on something called the Manhattan Project, which, as we all know, produced humanity's first atomic weapon. My grandfather was a nuclear physicist by trade, and this isn't some massive flex. I'm not saying he was Oppenheimer's right-hand man. No, he was one of hundreds of nuclear physicists working on specific problems, and obviously they were successful. After the war, my grandfather went to the private sector and settled outside of New York for several years, where he raised his family. That's where my mom grew up. Those were my earliest memories of my grandfather, not many, but some. And then he became a professor at MIT, teaching nuclear physics for several years. He eventually resettled. His job took him back into government work. He settled outside of DC, and that's where most of my memories are with the man. And they're great. We had great times. One of my grandfather's favorite things to do was to take me and my brother into DC, and those trips were incredible. He knew so much about the city and loved it so much, and we'd go on these walking tours, and we'd hit the Air and Space Museum or the Smithsonian, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. And he also knew all of these smaller, out-of-the-way, like sculpture gardens or points of interest. And he would teach us things, like how to read statues, which I didn't know that you could. And he would point to like a Civil War general on horseback, and he would say, okay, if both of the horse's front legs are up in the air, like the horse is rearing back, that indicates that the general on that horseback died on the battlefield. I went, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. If one of the horse's legs is up, that means that the person died from wounds sustained in battle, but not on the battlefield itself, like they made it to the hospital. And if all four of the horse's legs are on the ground, it means that the person died from causes unrelated to their military service. Awesome. Didn't know that. That stayed with me. I've since looked into that sculpture code, and while it is a real code, it's not followed all the time. It would depend on who commissioned the sculpture or the talent of the sculptor itself, because it's much more difficult to sculpt a horse almost vertical, balancing and all that weight and stuff. But still really interesting. And even like the Lincoln Memorial, he would say you could read that as well. Look at Lincoln's hands. One hand is a clenched fist that indicates strength and resolve, and the other hand is relaxed, indicating peace and serenity. So I would never describe my grandfather as someone who appreciated art. He was a scientist to the core, And whereas someone could describe him teaching my brother and I about how to read these sculptures or these statues, would say that that's him appreciating art. And they would be right. But for my grandfather, I'm sure he saw it as an algorithm or as a math problem or something to decipher, And that's one of those cool areas where art and science kind of overlap. And I have really, really fond memories of the man. And gosh, he died almost 20 years, more than 20 years ago now, 2005. So, and there's a reason I'm bringing all of this up, and it has to do with his time at MIT. Because I have a memory, and now listen, it's 40 years ago, so it's cloudy, but I talked to my brother about it, and he has a similar memory, so parts of it have to be true. But so I'm like 11 or 12, so it's the 80s, mid-80s, and we were at the Virginia House outside of D.C., and my grandfather was all excited because a group of students from his alma mater, from MIT, announced that they had designed a car. Specifically, I think it was a carburetor, maybe the whole engine, but I think it was just a carburetor, where they claimed that they could drive from Boston to Miami and back on one tank of gas. And they were about to or were just finishing this demonstration. I don't remember if what we watched was the celebration or the event of them leaving Boston or returning to Boston. But here's what I do remember. And this is where it might be apocryphal, or it might be been influenced by other forms of media over the years. But what I remember is that they get back, and they did it. They were successful. This engine went like 3,000 miles on a single tank of gas, which would mean they were getting like 200 or 300 miles to the gallon. And there was this dais set up with microphones, like they were fucking returning astronauts, right? And they were going to give this big press conference and tell everything, because there were 4 of them. And then, I don't even know if I'm making this up, but I remember the press conference was delayed by an hour because before they could get on the stage, they were ushered off into a private room and no one really knew what was going on. And then they get out on stage and the only statement was, "Thank you very much for coming. We have nothing to say." And they walked off. And the world never got this motor. We never saw it. And the conspiracy is that they met with oil executives that either threatened them or gave them $1 gazillion and told them to go away. And they did. And they took the money and ran, or they were in fear for their lives. So, and the reason, again, that I'm telling this whole story is that in honor of my grandfather and in honor of the curiosity of those MIT kids and in honor of the devil in us all that doesn't want the status quo to change, even in small ways individually or in large ways, like, oil producers that don't want cars to run more efficiently. I've been researching actual inventions that either exist or existed momentarily or apparently never existed because they were either ahead of their time or people in power had too much to lose. It's a series that I'm calling What We Built and What We Buried. And I'm dedicating it to my grandfather, Richard Ross. So with all that being said, we're going to go away from this more free-form style of me talking, and I'm getting into writer storytelling mode. I hope you enjoy. Please let me know in the comments. There are certain objects that seem almost by accident to fall outside the expectation of the world that produced them, as though they were built not merely to function within a moment, but to endure beyond it. They don't declare themselves as anomalies. They don't demand attention. Instead, they persist quietly. And over time, that persistence begins to feel less like coincidence and more like contradiction. In a modest fire station in Livermore, California, about 5 hours north of where I'm sitting right now, suspended from a simple cord that has been replaced more times than anyone has cared to document, there hangs a light bulb that has been burning continuously since 1901. Its glow is no longer what it once was. The filament has softened with age, its brightness diminished into a low amber that feels almost contemplative, as though aware of the decades it's passed through. But it hasn't failed. It hasn't surrendered to the expectation that all such things must eventually go dark. It has simply remained. Over the course of more than a century, it has illuminated a world that transformed itself in ways its makers could never have imagined. It has cast light across generations of firefighters, across tools and uniforms that evolved alongside the profession itself, across emergencies that reflected the changing shape of the society around it. It's burned through wars that redefined nations, through depressions that reshaped economies, through quiet years that left no mark except the passage of time itself. It has outlived the company that created it, outlived the assumptions that governed its design, outlived the idea that such endurance was even desirable. And if you stand beneath it long enough, longer than curiosity alone would require, longer than the casual observer is willing to remain, you might begin to feel a shift. Not in the object itself, but in the question it raises. Because the longer it burns, the more difficult it becomes to accept that what you are looking at is simply an artifact of a different era. It begins to feel like something else entirely. Not a relic. Evidence. Evidence that the limits we accept today were not always the limits that existed, and that somewhere between what was once possible and what is now considered normal, a decision was made. Not all at once, not loudly, but deliberately. And in about 10-12 minutes, we're going to reach chapter 3, where that decision stops feeling like progress and begins to feel like something else entirely. Welcome back to the new season of The Devil Within. We're going in a very different direction this time around. This is season 5. You're listening to What We Built and What We Buried. This is episode 1, The Immortal Bulb. Tonight, we step into a story that begins with invention, with optimism, with the quiet belief that progress moves forward in a straight and reliable line. And what we create improves simply because improvement is the nature of creation itself. But that belief, like most that feel self-evident, begins to fracture the moment you examine it closely enough. Now, before we go further, take a moment and make sure you're following the show wherever you're listening right now, because stories like this, they don't stay in the past. They start showing up everywhere, in the objects you use, the systems you rely on, and the assumptions you've never had a reason to question. There's a way in which Henry David Thoreau wrote about endurance, not as something dramatic or defiant, but as something patient, something that exists beyond our attempts to control or to define it. He understood that persistence does not need to announce itself to be meaningful, and that the things which last the longest often do so without drawing attention. That idea lingers here, because what we're looking at is not simply a light bulb that survived. It's something that has endured beyond the logic that now governs its entire kind. Chapter 1 of our story begins now. The shape of an invention. To understand why the light in Livermore feels so out of place in the modern world, you have to begin at the moment when light itself still carried weight, when it was not simply present, not taken for granted, but achieved. At the turn of the 20th century, electricity had not yet dissolved into the background of daily life. It hadn't become invisible. It was something you noticed, something you depended on consciously. A room didn't simply become bright with the flick of a switch. It was transformed. Darkness, which had governed human activity for thousands of years, began to retreat in ways that felt both liberating and slightly unnatural, as though a boundary long accepted had been quietly erased. Factories extended their hours. Streets held their shape long after sunset. Homes took on a different rhythm, one less dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. And within that transformation, there was an expectation, unspoken but widely shared, that what had been built would continue to improve, that each iteration would bring greater reliability, greater control, greater permanence. The companies that emerged in this space were not merely selling a product, they were shaping a new environment, one in which light was no longer temporary or conditional. It was something that could be summoned, sustained, and trusted. And trust, at that moment, meant endurance. Engineers approached the design of early light bulbs with a kind of seriousness that's difficult to reconcile with the disposability we accept today. Materials were not chosen simply for cost or efficiency, but for resilience. Filaments were tested not just for brightness, but for their ability to withstand time, to endure the slow, continuous strain of heat and current without breaking. And there was, in those early years, a kind of quiet pride in building something that didn't fail easily. Not because failure was impossible, but because it was resisted. Because every additional hour of operation represented not just technical success, but a kind of moral success. The fulfillment of a promise that the object would do what it was meant to do and continue to do it. The bulb that would eventually hang in Livermore was born out of that philosophy directly. It wasn't revolutionary in its design. It wasn't singular in its construction. It was simply well made, in the way many things were at that time, when durability had not yet been redefined as inefficiency. Its carbon filament was thicker than what would later become standard, designed to operate at a lower intensity but with greater longevity. It didn't burn with the same brightness as modern bulbs, but brightness was not the only measure of value. Longevity created its own significance. A bulb that lasted was a bulb that could be relied upon. A bulb that could be relied upon justified its existence. And so it burned. Not alone, but among many others like it, Bulbs installed in homes, in factories, in public buildings, each one carrying the same expectation of endurance. Most of them did what all objects eventually do. They failed. They were replaced. They disappeared into the quiet, unrecorded history of things that once worked and then didn't. But not the Livermore bulb. It remained, not because it was designed to become an artifact, but because it was designed to last. And it did so long enough to become something else entirely. Today, it exists as a contradiction. Not a miracle, not an anomaly in the technical sense, but a reminder that the assumptions we carry about how things work are not always rooted in what's possible. Because if something built in 1901 can continue to function well into the present day without the benefit of modern materials, modern testing, or modern engineering tools, then the question is no longer whether durability is achievable, because it clearly is. The question becomes why that durability is no longer standard. And that's not a technical question. That's a human question. Chapter 2. The first fracture. At first, nothing appears to be wrong. If you were to walk through a hardware store in the middle of the 20th century, or even decades later, you would see evidence of decline. You would see variety. Rows of light bulbs arranged with quiet precision, each one labeled according to brightness, wattage, intended use. Packaging would suggest progress. Improved efficiency, better output, redefined design. The language would be familiar and reassuring, built around the idea that each generation of a product represented an advancement over the last, and in many ways, it did. Light became brighter, more consistent, more affordable. Manufacturing scaled, distribution expanded. What had once been a luxury became an expectation. Entire societies reorganized themselves around the assumption that illumination was not something to be managed, but something to be assumed. But there was a detail, small at first, almost imperceptible, that didn't follow the pattern of improvement. The bulbs didn't last as long. Not dramatically shorter, not in a way that would cause immediate concern, but enough that replacement became routine. A bulb burned out, another took its place. The act was simple, almost automatic. It became the lead-in for countless jokes. It didn't invite reflection. It didn't suggest that anything unusual had occurred. Because failure, in small and predictable doses, feels natural. It becomes part of the rhythm of ownership. Something wears out, something breaks, needs to be replaced. And as long as that cycle remains manageable, affordable, convenient, it doesn't raise a lot of questions. But if you look closely, the pattern begins to reveal itself. A bulb that once might have lasted years now lasts months. A product that once justified its cost through endurance now justifies it through accessibility. The expectation shifts, subtly but persistently. It shifts from longevity to availability. And once that expectation takes hold, it becomes difficult to remember that things were ever different. And this is that first fracture, not in the object itself, but in our perception. Because the change doesn't announce itself as a reduction. It presents as adaptation, as alignment with the needs of a growing modern world. Efficiency becomes the dominant metric. Energy consumption is reduced. Cool. Production costs are optimized. It's more affordable. The narrative of progress continues uninterrupted, even as one of its original pillars, durability, that quietly recedes. It would be easy to attribute this to the natural evolution of technology, to assume that trade-offs are inevitable, that gains in one area must be balanced by losses in another. And in some cases, again, yes, that's true. But here, the balance feels, or imbalance, deliberate. Not forced by limitation, but guided by something else. And to understand that something else, you have to step back from the object and look at the system that produces it. By the 1920s, electric light had moved beyond novelty. It was no longer a rapidly expanding frontier. It had settled directly into the infrastructure. Homes are wired, cities are lit. The explosive growth that once drove demand, that began to stabilize. And with the stabilization came a new kind of pressure, one that had less to do with engineering and more to do with economics. If a product lasts too long, it disrupts the system that sustains it. A bulb that burns for decades, that doesn't need to be replaced. A household that doesn't replace its bulbs doesn't contribute to ongoing demand. And an industry that's built on production begins to encounter a problem it wasn't originally designed to solve. Not how to make something work, but how to ensure it continues to be needed. And this isn't a question that arises in isolation. It emerges gradually as companies observe patterns and track sales and measure demand over time. At first, it's just data, a slowing of replacement cycles, a plateau in growth that doesn't align with the expectations set during earlier expansion. But then it becomes a concern. Not catastrophic yet, not even urgent, just persistent. Because an industry that can't sustain demand can't sustain itself. And once that realization takes hold, well, the problem begins to change shape. It's no longer about improving the product in the abstract. It's about aligning the product with the system that depends on it. And this is where that first fracture deepens. Because the moment you begin to think of a product not only in terms of what it does, but in terms of how often it must be replaced, you introduce a new variable into its design, one that exists alongside performance, efficiency, and cost. A variable that measures not how long something can last, but how long it should last. And that distinction, quiet, almost invisible, marks the beginning of a shift that will extend far beyond light bulbs. It will move into every space where durability intersects with demand, where longevity competes with sustainability, where the success of a product begins to threaten the success of the system that produces it. At this stage, nothing has been decided, no agreement's been made, no standard has been set, but the conditions are in place. The question's been asked, and once a question like that is asked, it doesn't go unanswered. Chapter 3. The Devil Within. By the time the question of durability had fully taken shape, it no longer belonged to engineers alone. It had moved into the boardrooms, into conversations where the language was less about materials and resistance and more about stability, predictability, and the long-term viability of an industry that had, in a relatively short span of time, transformed the world, and now faced the quieter challenge of sustaining that transformation. What had begun as a technical pursuit, simply how do we make light more reliable, it had now become something else entirely. How to make it continue. And it's here, in this shift from possibility to management, that the story begins to reveal its true structure. Because once durability is no longer the only measure of success, it becomes one variable among many, and variables can be adjusted. In 1924, that adjustment took form. Representatives from the leading light bulb manufacturers of the time, companies whose names had become synonymous with modern progress, they all came together in an effort to bring order to a market that had outgrown its initial conditions. They didn't present themselves as conspirators. There was no mustache twirling. They weren't operating in secrecy so much as they were in alignment. They had common interests. They were responding to pressures that were visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. What they formed would later be known as the Phoebus Cartel. Its purpose, at least on the surface, was straightforward, although using the word cartel does make it sound a little Byzantine. But still, the purpose was to standardize production, ensure consistency, and stabilize pricing in a rapidly evolving global market. And these were not unusual goals. They reflected the kind of coordination that often emerges when industries mature and begin to regulate themselves in the absence of external control. But within that framework, another very cartel-y decision was made. Not announced as a reduction, not framed as a limitation, but introduced as a standard. A light bulb, they agreed, should last approximately 1,000 hours. Not because that was the maximum that could be achieved, but because it was the point at which performance, cost, and replacement aligned most effectively with the needs of the system that produced it. It was, in every sense, a calibrated decision, one that balanced what was possible with what was sustainable. Not for the product, not for us, but for them, for the industry. And once that standard was established, it began to shape everything that followed. Designs were adjusted, materials were reconsidered, testing protocols were implemented not to extend lifespan, but to ensure it remained within a defined range. Bulbs that lasted too long were no longer viewed as a superior product. They were anomalies, deviations from a standard that had been carefully constructed to serve a very different purpose. And this is the point at which the story becomes difficult to simplify. Because nothing in this process appears overtly malicious. There's no single moment that could be identified as a betrayal. No clear line where intention turns from improvement to degradation. Instead, it's a series of what seem like reasonable decisions, each one defensible within its context, each one aligned with the logic of sustainability on an industrial level. And yet, man, taken together, they produce a result that feels unmistakably different. Because the devil within this story is not the existence of that logic. It's the quiet realization that once it's accepted, it doesn't remain contained. It becomes the model, a new way of thinking, a framework that extends beyond a single product and into the broader structure of how things are made, how they're valued, and how long they're allowed to last. And we end up with terms in the tech industry like planned obsolescence. The Livermore bulb continues to burn, not because it exists outside the system, but because it was created before that system existed. It belongs to a different set of assumptions. And in that difference, it reveals something that's really easy to overlook. That the limits we experience aren't necessarily the limits that exist. They're often the limits that have been chosen. There's something almost, humbling about the persistence of the Livermore light bulb. Not because it defies science or exists outside the boundaries of what can be explained, but because it sits so quietly within those boundaries while exposing how rarely we choose to approach them. It doesn't burn anywhere near as bright as bulbs that surround it. It doesn't perform more efficiently. By most modern standards, it would be considered outdated, inferior, but still, it endures. And that endurance is not an accident. It's the result of a set of priorities that no longer guide the world in which we live. We like to think of progress as a process of continual improvement, a steady refinement of ideas and materials that leads us toward better outcomes. But progress isn't only shaped by what we can do, it's shaped by what we decide is worth doing. And once those decisions are made, once a system aligns itself around a particular definition of success, say, they begin to disappear into the background, becoming so familiar that they no longer feel like choices at all. The light bulb in Livermore remains because it was built before those choices were fully realized. It belongs to a different set of assumptions, a different understanding of value, one in which durability was not something to be negotiated, but something to be pursued. And in that quiet, unremarkable persistence, it leaves us with a question that's difficult to ignore once it's taken hold. Not whether we can build things that last. We can. But whether we still want to. Next time, we move beyond the question and into the decision itself, because the limitation of that light bulb's lifespan was not an accident, and it was not inevitable. It was agreed upon. We'll step inside the formation of the Phoebus cartel, examine the mechanics of how durability was redefined, and follow the ripple effect of that decision as it spreads far beyond a single industry. Because once a failure becomes a feature, that can't stay contained. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.